Welcome, everyone, to today's Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here. Today, we're exploring a truly fascinating section of biblical text from the Gospel of Mark. Specifically, we're looking at chapter 6, verse 45, all the way through chapter 7, verse 23. Now, at first glance, this text might seem like two completely unrelated events, right? I mean, on one hand, we've got this dramatic, miraculous sea rescue in the pitch black of night. And then on the other hand, we drop right into this really dense theological debate about ceremonial hand washing. But as you'll see, these two narratives are actually intimately connected by a profound theme, and that's the tension between divine revelation and human blindness. Okay, let's dive into this. To guide our analysis today, we've got some fantastic foundational material to work with. We're going to be anchoring our discussion in an amazing exegetical audio lecture series by Dr. Mark Jennings, which really breaks down the original Greek text and its whole historical context. And to round that out, we're also going to layer in some incredible insights from sermons and commentaries by Jeff Stott and Dick Donovan. This is going to really help us understand exactly how these ancient texts have been analyzed and applied over the years. Here is our roadmap for today. We're looking at a two-act narrative. First, the storm at sea, revealing divine identity and the disciples' hardened hearts. Then, we transition to the tradition of the elders, Korban and defilement, before finally seeing the deeper truth. Section 1, the storm at sea, stranded in the waves. So let's set the stage a bit. This happens right after the famous feeding of the 5,000. Jesus sends his disciples ahead in a boat while he actually withdraws up a mountain to pray. The disciples are totally isolated out on the water as this severe storm brews. And this brilliantly illustrates a framework developed by Jeff Stott, which he calls the three omnis of Jesus. Stott points out that even in a chaotic, dark storm, the disciples were never actually alone. First, there's omniscience, or perfect sight. Jesus saw their struggle all the way from the land. Second, omnipresence. He literally walks on water to reach them. And finally, omnipotence. He enters the boat and the storm is just instantly calmed. Let's map out the chronological timeline of this rescue because we really need to grasp the physical toll here. They set out in the evening. The text specifically notes that the wind was contrary, which basically means they were rowing directly into a gale. Imagine that. They are out there for hours, completely exhausted and straining at the oars. It actually isn't until the fourth watch of the night, which in Roman timekeeping is somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., that Jesus finally comes to them. They had literally been fighting these massive waves in the pitch black for almost the entire night before the rescue finally occurs at dawn. Section 2. Revealing divine identity. More than a miracle. Now, as our sources really emphasize, what happens out there on that water is so much more than just a physical rescue mission. Mark includes this really strange detail. He writes that as Jesus was walking on the water, he intended to pass by them. Now, what's really interesting about this is that at first glance, it sounds like Jesus was just going to leave them in the storm, like, see ya. But Dr. Jennings points out that the original Greek phrase here, par chase thai, is actually a highly specific Old Testament motif. If you look at the books of Exodus and 1 Kings, God passed by Moses and Elijah specifically to reveal his divine glory. So by using this exact phrasing, Mark is signaling to his readers that this is a full-blown divine epiphany. Jesus isn't abandoning them at all. He is actively revealing himself as the God of the Old Testament. But how do the exhausted disciples actually react to this grand divine epiphany? Well, they panic. The text says they thought they were seeing a phantasma, a ghost, or an apparition. And you have to remember their context here. They are physically drained, they're terrified of the storm, and they're functioning in a culture that held deep superstitions about spirits of the night bringing disaster. Because their human minds just couldn't conceive of God taking physical form and walking on the chaos of the sea, they assume it's a specter coming to finish them off. To calm their absolute sheer terror, Jesus speaks to them over the howling wind. In most of our English translations, it usually reads something like, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." But Dr. Jennings and the commentaries highlight something massive here. In the original Greek, the phrase used is ego eimi, which literally translates to I am. This isn't just a simple conversational, "Hey guys, it's me." No way. This is the divine name. It's a direct echo of God speaking to Moses from the burning bush in Exodus 3:14, saying, "I am who I am." Jesus is loudly declaring his ultimate identity and authority right over the top of the chaos of the storm. Section 3. Disciples' hardened hearts, failing to see. And that brings us to the tragic irony of the first half of our narrative. I mean, with the ultimate revelation of the divine standing literally right in front of them, the reaction exposes this massive internal disconnect. Mark gives us this incredibly sobering summary. He says, they were totally amazed, for they still didn't understand the significance of the loaves. Their hearts were too hard to take it in. Dr. Jennings notes that the disciples were suffering from a profound spiritual blindness. Sure, they were amazed by the magic of the water walking and the endless bread from earlier that day, but they completely missed the meaning. Their hearts were hardened, which is a classic biblical metaphor for spiritual resistance. They totally failed to grasp who Jesus truly was, despite these incredible miracles staring them right in the face.
Section 4. Tradition of the Elders, the Confrontation.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Act 2. The boat lands at Gennesaret, and the tone just immediately shifts from a struggle against nature to a struggle against religious authority. A delegation of Pharisees arrives to challenge Jesus, and this sets up a debate completely centered on competing priorities. The Pharisees noticed the disciples eating with unwashed hands. Now, we're not talking about modern hygiene here. This was about the tradition of the elders. These were unwritten oral laws that extended priestly temple purity rules into everyday life, things like ceremonially washing cups, pitchers, and hands. Jesus pushes back on this hard. He argues that these religious leaders are prioritizing their own man-made traditions over the actual written commands of God, which focus on internal purity and moral obedience. To really hammer his point home, Jesus delivers a heavy-hitting accusation. He reaches back and quotes the Old Testament prophet Isaiah directly at the Pharisees, saying, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules." I mean, what a striking indictment. He is essentially accusing the absolute highest religious authorities of the day of intense hypocrisy and spiritual blindness. They look incredibly pious on the outside, but their hearts, just like the disciples in the boat actually, are totally missing the point.
Section 5. Corban and True Defilement, the Heart of the Matter.
Now, Jesus doesn't just leave it at a general accusation. He provides a highly specific, real-world example of how these human traditions are actively breaking God's commandments. So the crucial point is this concept of korban. Korban is an Aramaic term that literally means a gift dedicated to God. Our sources explain that over time, the religious leaders had essentially developed korban into a sort of religious loophole, and Jesus masterfully uses it to expose the deep flaws in their entire system. Let's look step by step at how this loophole actually worked in practice, because it's pretty wild. First, an individual could declare their money or property as korban, meaning it's entirely devoted to God. Second, despite that public declaration, the person could legally continue to use those resources for themselves during their own lifetime. Third, and this is the most shocking part, if their aging parents fell on hard times and asked for financial help, the individual could literally just say, "Sorry, my money is korban, I can't give it to you." Jesus points out that this man-made tradition directly and intentionally nullifies the fifth commandment, which clearly explicitly states, "Honor your father and your mother."
So having completely dismantled their tradition, Jesus then redefines what actually makes a person unclean. He turns to the crowd and tells them it's not external things, like eating your lunch with unwashed hands, that defile you. True defilement comes from inside. It pours out of the human heart. Things like evil thoughts, theft, murder, deceit, arrogance. These are internal moral corruptions. With this, Jesus shifts the entire paradigm of purity completely away from ceremonial rituals to the much harder work of the transformation of the inner self.
Section 6. Seeing the deeper truth, the unified message. As we weave these two seemingly totally disparate stories back together, our source material notes a really fascinating little parenthesis that the author Mark inserts right into the text. Mark writes, "In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean." Dr. Jennings observes that this is Mark's own extrapolation, and it perfectly reflects how the early church understood Jesus' teaching. This was a total, paradigm-breaking shift away from strict rule-keeping and external compliance, moving entirely toward the necessity of internal transformation and true, deep understanding. And that brings us to the core narrative arc connecting the two halves of our text today, the two blindnesses. On one side, you have the disciples out in the storm. They're blinded by their physical fear and a total lack of spiritual comprehension. Their hearts are hardened and they completely miss the great I am standing right in front of them. Then, on the other side, you have the Pharisees. They are blinded by rigid human traditions and an absolute obsession with external appearances, completely missing the true moral commands of God's heart.
Both of these groups, despite their incredible proximity to Jesus, suffer from a profound failure to truly see.
And that leaves us with a really provocative thought to end on today. When we look at this text, it forces us to examine our own spiritual eyesight, doesn't it? Are we so focused on just surviving the chaotic storms of life, or perhaps so obsessed with keeping up external appearances that we are entirely missing the deeper, divine truth standing right in front of us? It's a challenging question for sure, and one that I hope leaves you eager to dig even deeper into this incredible source material. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.